Welcome to another episode of the Ramphal Dialogues, the official podcast of the Ramphal Institute, a Commonwealth Organization research institute featuring influential thinkers, policymakers, civil society leaders from around the world as they weigh in about key events and development issues affecting and shaping the Commonwealth world. From the health impacts of air pollution to climate finance, climate justice and migration, education governance, the blue economy, green transition, and international trade, Ramphal Dialogues explores fundamental questions and offers analysis and commentary to broaden perspectives on Commonwealth affairs. Today we are joined by Tash, Senior Consultant for OnePlanet, and Niamh James, current Interior Designer student at UAL and former Senior Consultant for OnePlanet. In this episode, we're discussing the upcoming UK elections and its potential impact on future climate action. Welcome, Niamh and Tash.
Hello. Hey, Kelsie. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to be here and to discuss the election.
So the UK general elections is scheduled for July 4th, 2024. Let's begin by talking about where the UK stands currently in its climate action progress and what is required to keep the UK on track to meet their net zero targets by 2050.
Yes, well, yeah, I can kick things off. So currently, the UK local government, I would say the two main strategies regarding climate action are the net zero strategy, and then also the Environment Act. And so the net zero strategy, it basically commits that or pledges that the UK will achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And then the Environment Act, which was published in 2021, is aiming to improve the UK's action towards sustainability, zero waste, and other kind of nature-related issues.
Yes, I'll just jump in. I think the net zero by 2050, just as a target, considering we're a country which has all the resources in the world essentially to be doing climate action, 2050 is not an ambitious enough target. Like, we all know that we're zooming past the 1.5 degree warming set by the Paris Agreement in 2015. So it's like this strategy came out in 2021, I think, the net zero strategy. Don't quote me on that, but it's fairly recent. And the fact that the core purpose of this strategy is to get to net zero by 2050, I think is honestly unambitious, and we should be focusing on a far nearer goal, considering that we seem to overshoot every goal anyway. That's sort of my overarching opinion about the net zero strategy.
Can you also talk a little bit about some of the backtracking that happened with climate policies last year?
Yes, so obviously we know that kind of the current government has backtracked on pledges of no new. Well, we know that there needs to be no new oil and gas fields, but the current Conservative government have still been allowing new oil and gas licenses to be issued to oil and gas companies. And they say they're doing this in the name that this will increase energy security, which is obviously something that is really affecting the UK at the moment. However, research has shown that any new licenses that are going out to these oil and gas projects, we're actually not going to reap the there's not going to be any economic benefit to the everyday civilian from these projects. All it's going to do is hinder our progress towards net zero, and it's just lining the pockets of these oil and gas companies. So yeah, we know that for them, approving these new oil and gas projects, it's not the thing about it being about energy security is a load of rubbish. It is just there to create more profits.
Yeah, I can agree more with that. Also, this is maybe jumping ahead, but in the Conservative manifesto, obviously the elections you mentioned are coming up next week. In their manifesto, there are pledges around new gas power stations and ensuring annual licensing rounds for oil, like further oil and gas production. All in the name of energy security, like Niamh said. And that's not to say that there's not action on renewables. There is, but to have new gas power stations in this climate crisis, and as a country that's meant to be at the forefront of innovation, I'm not best pleased that they're able to create a manifesto like this whilst also having a net zero target of 2050.
Right. Yeah, and it blows that zero target completely out the window. Like, there is no way categorically, again, research has shown that the UK will be able to achieve a 2050 target, let alone a 2030 target, which, you know, is really what they should be aiming for. There's no way they're going to achieve a 2050 target if they are handing out new licenses to oil and gas.
So both the Labour and Conservative Party have laid out their manifestos, and within these manifestos, again, they're detailing the net zero plans for the country. So between the Conservative and Labour Party manifestos, are there any key differences that you're seeing?
Yes, I would say the main one is that, so the Conservatives, as we've said, they're pledging for net zero by 2050, whereas the Labour Party are committing to sort of zero carbon by 2030 instead, and they are planning to do this with the new energy company that they are planning to set up, which is called Great British Energy. I would say this is kind of at the forefront of their campaign, and it will be a publicly owned energy company that is hoping to drive investment in renewable energy and securing energy security this way, instead by expanding renewable energy, instead of as Tash said, the Conservatives still are planning to expand renewable energy, but not at the same rate as the Labour Party have pledged to do so.
Yeah, and just an interesting thing through looking at both strategies side by side is obviously it's all well and good developing renewable supply of energy, but neither strategy actually talk about reducing energy demands, so becoming more efficient as a country with our energy and reducing overall energy demands, which obviously if we need less energy in the first place, it's far easier to supply that through renewable sources. So that just feels like an easy win for climate that should have been addressed in both strategies, and I couldn't find anything.
I do have here the Labour Party do plan to invest 6.6 billion to upgrade 5 million homes in the UK, across the UK, with installation and energy efficiency improvements by 2030. Which obviously is better than nothing, but still, if you consider how many people there are in the country, I'd say that they have to be aiming for a lot more than 5 million.
So in your from what you're seeing of both plans, you're saying, well, as of now and from the plans, it's insufficient to meet our 2050 targets and even 2030.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to do the analysis, but I haven't seen any strategies which are ambitious enough. Obviously, there's some things which are hard to deliver on, but the fact that manifestos are places to be ambitious, and to bring in everything you possibly can. So whether that be nature-based solutions, like focusing on climate adaptation, and like alternative technologies. And we're meant to be a leading country in innovation. Fine, there is parts of the manifesto which talk about investment in innovation, which is good. But then also there needs to be a real focus on scaling back wasted energy, wasted resource, or resource where we're actually just putting all of this like potential innovation and using the knowledge and expertise in ways which are taking us further away from the net zero target rather than closer. Obviously there's all like the economy to be thinking about, and I understand that, but you only have to look at like the green transition argument to be able to flip that on its head and just think like, why are we still trying to work within this system that we're fighting a system which once almost is like built for climate collapse to happen, rather than trying to find solutions which will rebuild a better alternative.
Yeah, I would just want to echo what Tash. No, I just want to echo what Tash has said in terms of, I think, and yeah, another thing that is always like quite frustrating, I think, especially if you're someone that works in the sort of sustainability or has an interest in the whole kind of sustainability kind of realm, is I think a lot of people would, well, I think depending on how you approach sustainability, a lot of people would say that our obsession with growth and economic growth, especially in terms of measuring economic growth via things like GDP, is it doesn't work. It's what has caused this climate devastation, because you're not measuring what actually matters. You're not actually if we take the Tories, for example, okay, we might be one of the richest countries in the world. However, I think I read that 25% of children in the UK are living in poverty, and that is absolutely insane. And so how can one of the richest, it begs the question of how can one of the richest countries have so many children that are living in poverty? And it's because the economic system that we follow just fundamentally doesn't work. And I think the frustrating thing of reading both the Labour and the Conservative parties' manifestos is that they both have a kind of, they're still building on this fantasy of economic growth is going to solve all of our problems, when actually history is showing that it's actually just making everything worse. And on that note, I think it's also interesting as well, the two differences as well in terms of how the parties are planning to fund some of the sort of pledges that they've set out. So the Labour Party they've said that their kind of main funding sources of delivering their manifesto will come from tax avoidance clampdown, which is obviously really important, that people who are avoiding tax, which does tend to be people as well that have the most amounts of money, are getting taxed properly, and those loopholes that they're dodging are being closed. And then they are also planning to implement a windfall tax, or expand the windfall tax that already exists on oil and gas companies, to obviously fund this transition to a sort of greener future. Whereas the Conservative Party, their funding sources are through private sector investment, classic for the Conservative Party, and they've said through efficiency savings, which basically means they're going to cut budgets and to free up money. So I think really just from that point of view, I know which one I'd prefer to be voting for. Something I really thought was important to mention is that some of the policies as well that the Conservative government have introduced are policies around making it more difficult for civilians to protest, including policies that grant police powers to impose conditions on protests that are considered too noisy, or kind of protests that are, static, the ones that tend to be like sit-ins or things like that. They're giving police more powers to kind of shut these types of protests down. And then they're giving them powers to enable them to arrest civilians that are in breach of any conditions that the police decide to impose. They're making it easier for police to stop and search civilians, and then also around protests. And then they've also made locking on, so when protesters will glue themselves to a building or lock themselves to each other so that they can stay sighted in a place, they've made it a criminal offence. And I think so all of these things that previously have made protest the way that it is and have actually enabled change to happen, these are now being limited due to the policies that the Conservative government have put in place. And I think many people would agree that these measures are a threat to sort of our democratic rights of speech and peaceful assembly. And I think it's really important to note actually how important this is, because it was protests by Extinction Rebellion that encompassed these types of protest behaviour that got the UK government to declare a climate emergency in the first place. And so, yeah, the fact that the Conservative government during their time in power brought something like this in is actually really, really scary, because it means that, anyone that is a civilian, an activist that is trying to stop anything that is going to impact our progress to net zero or, amend the climate crisis in a way we see fit, is going to make us harder to kind of voice those opinions and stop those bad policies from happening.
I couldn't agree more with that, Niamh. And actually a really interesting way that I've been thinking about or looking through and analysing the manifestos and any policy that comes through essentially, as well as the proposed manifestos across all the main political parties at the moment, is looking at how equity is embedded into all of their strategies and their decision-making policies. Obviously, if your strategies are coming from a place which is helping to deliver better equity across groups, across whether it be class, race, religion, sexuality, whatever, across different countries and areas who've paid the price or continue to pay the price of climate change despite having contributed very little in terms of emissions. It's an interesting way to actually look at whatever strategy it is and look, okay, where is this actually coming from? Is it coming from a place of national interest? Is it coming from a place of economic interest with the idea of growth that Niamh's already spoken about? Or is it coming from a place of actually trying to establish a more equitable future? And that's sort of been my main interest.
Another thing that I think is worth mentioning is that, yes, while some of the kind of policies that are currently in place, such as things around the Environment Act, whilst they are really good pieces of work and are saying lots of great things, Tash and I have experience from working with local governments that things like achieving biodiversity net gain, which is something that's been sort of set out by central government for local governments to deliver, as well as their local nature recovery strategies. Whilst these things are all great and really important, the thing that is lacking is that there hasn't been sufficient funding in place in order for these local governments to deliver these targets, and there's not the resources there to achieve these goals. So it's kind of frustrating, I guess, and it's very unfair on local governments, because you've got central government outlining all of these amazing policies that sound great, but then giving the hard part to the local governments to deliver them without sufficient funding and resources. So I do think that is another thing as well to kind of bear in mind with the sort of current policy context when it comes to climate action and biodiversity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Niamh. I wanted to segue now to voters and the influence that this manifesto, especially the environmental aspect of it, will have on this election.
Like how much weight, these climate plans are influencing voters. Like, could it possibly sway their decision in who they're voting for?
I think it's do you know what? It's difficult. I think it's a difficult one to call, because I think for people, like attracts like. So I would like to think, the people that I surround myself with, I think that, or the kind of people that the communities that I create online amongst sort of within Instagram and the sort of people I follow online, it very much feels as though, and the people I surround myself with in my real life, it would feel as though these sorts of policies around net zero, nature, recovery are on people's agenda, and that those things will be, swaying how people are going to vote in this general election. But then, you can have conversations with people that very much fall outside of that kind of bubble that you've created for yourself, where these sorts of topics aren't even on people's agenda, and instead, you have policies, or you have certain parties pushing for policies around creating divides in society, whether that's around how trans people are treated in our society, or around refugees and migration, that will be their, things like that will be their sole focus, and they will kind of sit above the climate crisis, because I think it just very much depends on the individual voter. I think it's quite difficult to sort of gauge how people are going to, or how the general public is going to vote on these certain issues. I mean, I would say that, and I spoke about this earlier, that I think a lot of people are not wanting to vote Conservative or Labour because of their stance on the situation that's been happening in Gaza. And I think I think the Green Party this year have produced a really great manifesto, and a manifesto that is fair. It would tackle lots of issues that people are facing, like energy security, whilst also, lowering carbon emissions, etc. And I think a lot of people, or from how I've been interacting with people, would want to vote for someone for a party like the Green Party. But the general election is very much seen as a two-party race between Labour and the Conservatives. And one of the main reasons that people are wanting to vote for the Green Party, for example, is because they have very much always and throughout this past year had a very strong stance on how they feel about the situation in Gaza. That's kind of been one of the only real sort of, I guess, defining sort of positions where people are kind of Sorry, I'm rambling a bit there. And I think the thing that the other thing I would say is, it's very much seen at the moment as, a two-party race between the Labour Party and the Conservatives. And if you are someone that, likes the Green Party and supports their manifesto, look, they are aiming and campaigning for, I think, 4 or 5 seats in Parliament this year. So that's where all of their kind of funding for their campaigning is going, is just securing those 4-5 seats where they feel like they're going to be able to swing the vote over to them. And so I would just recommend to people that if you do like their manifesto, see if they are, if your kind of constituency is one of the places that they're trying to get a swing vote, because if so, then, and if you're looking for the party that is going to be doing the most on climate, the Green Party is for sure the answer to that. And I think it's also worth noting as well that the Green Party is probably the only party that is standing up and saying that our manifesto has been fully costed, which I think is really important. So it's not just a manifesto based on false promises. They are saying that their manifesto has been fully costed, and it is actually possible to deliver what they are saying they would deliver. Yeah,
I think that is very important. And the same thing usually here and in a lot of other countries is very bipartisan, and it's kind of hard to get people to look at a third party, especially when they're young.
Exactly.
Especially in these times too, where cost of living and all of we're just in a lot of crisis. So it feels it's a very uncertain thing to then elect a party that we've never seen before. It's a risk.
No, definitely, no, 100%. And also, it's obviously confusing as well if you've got, you're talking about like the cost of living crisis and something like energy security. It's very confusing as well if you've got, say, the Conservatives that are saying that we're going to, make energy security better by opening up new oil and gas fields. We're doing this to protect energy security, versus the Labour Party that are saying we're going to increase energy security by, creating our new publicly owned renewable energy company based here in the UK. As a kind of everyday civilian, you're going to be thinking, oh, who do I believe? They're both saying that each of their pledges, very, very different, are going to deliver energy security. Which one should I go for? And so that can actually make, it can make things really confusing and difficult. I will give you the answer though. In that case, it will be the Labour Party's pledge that will actually deliver energy security. Research has shown that the Conservatives' pledge on the opening of oil and gas fields in terms of energy security is a load of rubbish. So don't believe that one.
Okay. The last question I kind of wanted you guys to cover is, OnePlanet. If you want to tell us a bit more about the platform and the current project, which is mapping the manifesto that you're working on.
Collectively, with a bunch of young people all around the country, myself and Niamh helped to develop what we're calling the Young Leaders Manifesto, which is an ongoing sort of under development manifesto of a collective bunch of outcomes that we want to see being implemented across. Originally it was made for climate strategies, but they're so broad, covering things from health to equity to energy and community, that actually we're now using them to analyse the manifestos for the party manifestos ahead of the election. Obviously it's a non-political manifesto we're using to do the comparisons, so we can be as objective as possible whilst using our subjective opinion of what we need to do for a sustainable future. So it's kind of it's created an interesting resource, which means that around each of any of our core areas of interest, whether that be looking after the well-being of future generations, so considering equity in a long time frame rather than an immediate sort of sense of equity or a small time frame, which we've taken this idea directly from Wales, which were the first country to implement that into law, that all new policies and strategies need to consider and equitably deliver for future generations. We can see who is actually around, when I say who, which strategy, which manifesto is doing what, whether it be to positively help deliver these goals. For example, like changing our capitalist growth economy to a circular economy model, or focusing on local food production and improving access to sustainable and healthy diets, or improving access to nature. We can see which manifesto is doing what, and whether, or says that they'll do what if they come into power, and whether this will positively or negatively help to deliver those core central goals. And it can be really interesting to look at, for example, what one around climate migration, what the various politics are doing, various manifestos are doing. So it basically means that through this resource you can zoom in on whatever you're most interested in, whether that be peace, which obviously at the moment peace levels around the world are probably one of the lowest they've ever been, if you look internationally, whether it be looking at economics or health or whatever. You can directly compare manifesto to manifesto and down to a fine level of specific components within manifestos. Like, I'm looking at the Strive for Peace goal right now, and I can see straight away that the Reform Party, obviously not one of the two main ones, but an influential party in the UK, have a pledge to cut foreign aid by 50% if they were to get into power, which obviously is not going to be doing good things for striving for peace internationally. As well as, you could look at nuclear weapons, you could look at where spending's going, and whether the manifestos are focused on sort of national level peace, or also looking at climate justice and helping to deliver peace worldwide. So yeah, that's basically the resource. It's public facing, you don't need to log in or anything, and we're hoping to basically have this resource open for as long as people are interested in it, to explore the strategies in a way which doesn't involve reading a 100-page PDF.
Right.
Yeah, that's quite dead.
No, it's a good visual for sure. And you said that is it public already?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I'll give you the links to that.
Okay, and then I'll post it.
I think that's all we have time for today.
Thank you both for joining me to talk about this important conversation.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah, it's been great to discuss this.
Thank you.
Also, just a message to listeners: please vote. Whatever it is you want to vote for, just vote.
Yeah, your vote counts.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Ramphal Dialogues. Hope to see you next time.